Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Stephen. Really great to be with you today and to present this paper, which has already been nicely teed up by the special collections that we've just viewed. One of the items in that was this piece that I'm going to, at least in the back end of this paper, just bring some reflections on that links the 17th and 18th century in a nice way. So as Stephen said, I've just finished my PhD with Professor John Coffey and Professor Alan Ford as my supervisors, and Anthony Milton as the examiner. So that's the kind of work that's been done more in the 17th century, but I've really enjoyed just beginning to view items that join the dots from one century to the other and into Wesley studies. So that's what this paper hopefully will do a little bit of. So here we go. In the 18th century, Augustus Toplady alleged that John Wesley had raised the ghosts of 17th century English Arminians. And in particular, he singled out the regicidal Puritan John Goodwin as having influenced the theology of John Wesley. So this paper will first consider surprising forms of 17th century English Arminianism, which paradoxically flourished throughout a decade characterised by Puritan rule, the 1650s in particular. For during this Cromwellian decade, Puritan, Episcopal and sectarian strains of Arminianism were propagated on an unprecedented scale in print and in public debate. We will then consider evidence of later reception and adaptation as John Wesley drew on controversial 17th century Arminian works published during the English Revolution in order to formulate his rebuttal to Calvinist theology. Particular attention will be given to marginal notes in Wesley's personal copy of Arenomachia, or The Agreement and Distance of Brethren, published by John Goodwin in 1652. Wesley prepared this item for publication, and that copy is now held here at the Rylands Library, as we've seen. Consideration of these 17th century sources that informed Wesley's 18th century Arminianism should enable an original perspective that will help to join the dots between different episodes of doctrinal controversy in the 17th and 18th centuries. So first we journey back to the mid-17th century. In 1604 at the Hampton Court Conference, King James I had famously declared a warning against any undermining of episcopal rule: no bishop, no king. You may be familiar with that famous mantra. Well, by the 1650s this had proven prophetic. There was now for the next decade no bishop and no king. This period of the Commonwealth and Cromwellian rule witnessed a surprising phenomenon, the rise of English Arminianism. During the very decade of Puritan hegemony, numerous publications from scholarly folios to popular pamphlets attacked the doctrinal commitments of Reformed theology. Most surprising were those from within the Puritan fold, as the likes of John Goodwin, John Horne, and of course John Milton formulated anti-Calvinist soteriologies predicated upon conditional decrees of election and a resistible grace of salvation. The old enemy also reared its head as a new breed of episcopal or Laudian anti-Calvinists, including the likes of Henry Hammond and Thomas Pearce, also attacked the commitments of Reformed theology. And those familiar battle lines, Puritan and Anglican most broadly, were further confused by the insurgence of various sectarians who flourished under the relative amnesty of Cromwellian toleration. Socinians, Ranters, Quakers and General Baptists all contributed to the siege that was laid against Calvinist doctrines within this decade of Puritan rule, the 1650s. This cacophony of mechanic preachers and plebeian pamphleteers represented a new style of anti-Calvinism which also eroded Reformed theology. Those considered fanatics and heretics published pamphlets, preached sermons, and held public debates in order to expose the theological and pastoral inadequacies of Calvinism. Consequently, by 1655, Obadiah Howe, one of the godly, one of the Reformed Puritans, voiced a growing concern among Reformed divines that the continental Arminian controversy had only now spread to England. Here's his quote: "It is well known that those flames that did utterly consume the peace of the Belgic Church have miserably of late broken out amongst us." Of course, he's referring to the Synod of Dort and the Arminian controversy in 1618 and 1619 on the continent, where the Remonstrant party represented 5 objections to the Reformed theology, or Calvinism, inspired by the arguments of Jacobus Arminius. They were roundly rejected by an international synod of Reformed delegates, subsequently known as the Contra-Remonstrants. But during the 1650s, English divines became aware of an unfolding domestic contest, aptly dubbed the quinquarticular controversy, the 5 points controversy, now happening in England during the 1650s. This unprecedented attack on Calvinist soteriology was coupled with increased engagement with Catholic, Lutheran, and Remonstrant alternatives, and resulted in sophisticated Arminian publications on a scale that far exceeded the Laudian era. As William Lamont, the historian, has noted, the theological issues, this is a quote now, the theological issues raised by Arminians in the Netherlands at the end of the 16th century got a proper airing in England neither just before the Civil War, nor even during it, but after it. The golden age of theological debate on Arminianism was in the England of the 1650s. In short then, an unprecedented blizzard of anti-Calvinist voices in the 1650s amounted to something of an intellectual crisis for Calvinism and caused the theological tide to turn over the course of the second half of the 17th century. And it's just worth observing that where the theological prevailing winds were coming from at the beginning of the 17th century to where they were at the end of the 17th century is a remarkable story in its own right. And this paper is in part arguing that the 1650s, not the Laudian era, were the sort of hinge decade where that turn accelerated in a different direction. Hence, the Church of England, by the time of Wesley's birth, is a very different theological animal to what it was at the turn of the 17th century. So all of that sets up, if you like, the historical introduction or context. But I want to now consider the Arminianism of John Goodwin and how that influenced John Wesley more than a century later. As I speak of John Goodwin, a Puritan who became an Arminian, that sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't it? The idea of a Puritan Arminian sounds like a contradiction. If you're familiar at all with sort of popular level presentations of Puritan writings, you'll know that they are nearly always entirely, the sort of canon of Puritan writings that's published these days is nearly always assuming that to be Puritan was to be Calvinist. But the likes of John Goodwin and John Milton and others, who clearly most historians would have no quibble over the fact that they were part of the Puritan milieu, were clearly challenging this presentation of Puritanism. And so in the 1650s, part of what was going on was that there was a new level of engagement with Arminian writings. Cromwellian toleration enabled this. Lutheran and Dutch Arminian sources were being given publishing opportunities they hadn't previously had under the rule of Charles I. So after reading Dutch Arminian publications, Richard Baxter, for example, later admitted his pre-Civil War ignorance, quotes, "I did ignorantly think that Arminianism had been a more intolerable, pernicious evil to the Church than since I found it." Equally, John Goodwin, the vicar of St Stephen's, Coleman Street in London, a prestigious Puritan preaching platform, he also engaged with the writings of continental Arminians by 1647, and to his surprise, instead of finding rank import, which is what he expected, he discovered in Arminius a fair, quotes, a fair and reasonable construction, fully reconcilable with the judgments and expression of some Reformed churches. John Goodwin therefore emerged as the foremost example of a Puritan Arminian. His Puritan credentials were impeccable. He was raised in the Puritan heartland of Norfolk, educated at Queen's College, Cambridge, under John Preston, appointed vicar of St Stephen's, Coleman Street, one of London's flagship Puritan parishes. Throughout his life, Goodwin retained his commitment to experimental piety, Reformed Protestantism, and evangelical conversionism. His writings are replete with humanist exegesis, scholastic reasoning, Reformed authorities, and pastoral exhortations that exemplify the Puritan style, with its hotter sort of Protestantism. However, after his transition in the late 1640s, Goodwin became one of the most vocal and influential protagonists of the two tenets of Arminian theology, conditional decrees of election and the resistible nature of grace. Goodwin's first outing for this newfound Arminianism was not in print, but in a series of public disputations with Vavasor Powell and John Simpson in London, conducted in December 1649 in the presence of diverse ministers of the City of London and thousands of others. These disputations gained notoriety. A learned Puritan divine contesting Calvinism in the free air of Cromwellian London was sensational and indicative of the crumbling of the Calvinist consensus. The respect that Powell showed for the learned and godly Goodwin evidenced the intra-Puritan nature of this debate. Delivered from Calvinism, Goodwin, in the free air of London, now contended for Arminian theology, and he said this: "I deny that these decrees respect persons equally considered. They respect species of men. The decree of election from eternity was that whoever believes should be saved." Ever since his conversion in 1647 to Arminian theology, Goodwin had been working towards a substantial work that would harness his learning in a bid to redeem grace from Calvinist distortion. A year after these public debates, Goodwin's magnum opus was published in folio, comprising over 600 pages, entitled Redemption Redeemed. It remains one of the most substantial English tomes written in defence of Arminianism. In the preface, Goodwin conveyed his rejection of Calvinism in quite graphic terms. Quote, "I found it ever and anon gravelish in my mouth and corroding and fretting in my bowels." Emboldened by this fresh revelation, Goodwin self-consciously stepped out of the way more generally occupied. But here's the interesting point. Nevertheless, Goodwin repeatedly cited Augustine and Calvin for support, ironically claiming that his Arminian approach offered the most consistent interpretation of Scripture and the Reformed tradition. He even claimed that, quote, "For the most part, Chrysostom among the ancient expositors and Calvin himself among the modern are my companions in the paths of my greatest solitariness." That's an important point to note, that he's therefore claiming new approaches to theology, but claiming Calvin for support, which is an unusual combination for any Arminian. And Goodwin, to do this, had various rhetorical strategies. Sometimes he argued that the story that continues sometimes today, which is Calvin versus the Calvinists. He argued sometimes that he was a true interpreter of Calvin and the later English Calvinists had misconstrued Calvin's thinking. Sometimes he argued that. Other times he was even as bold as to say that Calvin had glimpsed the truth but then was too frightened to own it and went back into his error. He had various strategies, that's the point, to try and understand how his theology was in fact in line with Calvin, and yet ironically saying something very different. And not just Calvin, he quoted others as well. Goodwin therefore considered himself part of necessary further reform within Protestantism, part of reform, the Reformed tradition, but the need for further reform. He even claimed this: Luther, Calvin and Melanchthon left it under so much craziness and unsoundness that other physicians must now complete the work. Consequently, the most striking and novel aspect of Goodwin's Puritan-style Arminianism was that his vociferous anti-Calvinism regarding absolute decrees and irresistible grace in no way equated to being anti-Calvin or the Reformed tradition. On the contrary, Goodwin attempted in ironic fashion to turn citations from Reformed luminaries against the very doctrines associated with them. Now, Redemption Redeemed caused, as you could imagine, an enormous reaction among the godly. The Puritans at the time, Goodwin came under huge attack. And in response to his critics, Goodwin churned out several more works devoted to the defence of Arminianism. One of these leads us to the item held here in the Rylands Library. Goodwin, as vicar of St Stephen's, Coleman Street in London, was also a Congregationalist, and so he pastored a gathered congregation within this church. And in 1652, Goodwin's gathered congregation published Arenomachia, which is two Greek words effectively meaning on the making of peace, or the making of peace. Arenomachia, and then the subtitle, The Agreement and Distance of Brethren. Now you can hear in that title, this was an attempt to show a united front from his church, emphasising the agreement that they shared with the Reformed tradition and points of distance or difference as well. It was signed by 14 leading members and dedicated to Oliver Cromwell himself. You can see here, I think, the title page of the first edition, 1652, of this work by Goodwin, dedicated to Oliver Cromwell. Unlike other polemical works by Goodwin, this irenical piece emphasised the common ground shared with Calvinists regarding the 5 articles of remonstrance: election and reprobation, the death of Christ, the grace of God, the liberty of the will, and perseverance. This chiselled and winsome work offers arguably the finest succinct defence of Arminian theology from the early modern period, and deserves a greater audience today. If only debates that he conducted then were carried out with such an ironical spirit beyond his time, we'd be in a better place. The work also conveyed a certain optimism that soon this revised approach to theology, this reformed theology in the sense of further reform, would sweep across England and the universities and beyond. Now, all of that to say then, Goodwin published this work, and you can see a couple of quotes within it that illustrate Goodwin's approach to theology that came through. For example, he says that we hold that the only decree of election that can be asserted from the Scriptures is this, for substance and effect: whosoever believeth shall be saved, and the only decree of reprobation this, whosoever believeth not shall be damned. In other words, the gospel, the proclamation of the gospel, is the only basis for election. Also, he says, effectively, Calvinism presents the gospel to men like a lottery, wherein there are many blanks but few prizes, in which respect sober and considering men refuse to adventure their money upon it. Now, all of that brings us then to a few reflections on the item that connects this piece by Goodwin to the item that John Wesley had marked up that's held here. So fast forward over a century, and we can appreciate both the appeal and the problematic nature of a Puritan Arminian like Goodwin for John Wesley. Wesley clearly engaged with and disseminated the ideas of English Arminians like Goodwin. He published one of Goodwin's other works, an exposition of the 9th chapter of Romans, which he published. John Wesley published this work by John Goodwin in the first 4 issues, extracts of it, in the first 4 issues of Volume 3 of the Arminian magazine, published in 1780. Then in 1782, whilst in Liverpool, Wesley worked to prepare Goodwin's Arenomachia for publication also. And again, you can see here, I think, the item that's held here, you can see the page. Those are not John Wesley's fingers there, they're mine. But that is John Wesley's handwriting, as you can see. And he prepared this, actually a 3rd edition copy from 1671. He prepared this seemingly for publication. In Wesley's hand here, you can see the following: to the reader, the strong sense in the following tract will, I apprehend, make amends for the roughness of the style. I recommend it to the intelligent reader as containing the very marrow of the controversy. John Wesley, Liverpool, April the 11th, 1782. It's ironic, actually, that he says it's for the intelligent reader. When Goodwin wrote it, it was a drop-down version for the popular level engagement. So it shows how things have shifted in terms of the theological literacy of the audiences from the 17th to the 18th century. Then throughout the work, Wesley's hand makes careful and considerable amendments. Many are clearly attempts to just simply to simplify or update the wording from the 17th to the 18th century, benign amends, changes, including the removal of scholastic distinctions and Latin references that would not have been suitable for a less theologically educated audience. However, and I say this slightly tentatively, I've viewed the item, looked at it quite carefully, but I still think there's a lot more that I want to do with it, and others may well want to as well. So these are just some early reflections on the more interesting patterns of editorial work in Wesley's hand. Just two things in particular that stand out. Firstly, Wesley seems consistently to revise and reduce Goodwin's emphasis on reprobation. In order to demonstrate maximum affinity with his reformed brethren, Goodwin's tract contains numerous references to the justice of God that rightly damns the reprobate, even if in a conditional manner. However, Wesley seems uncomfortable with this in terms of the edits and seems more cautious. Indeed, in Wesley's own extended tract, Predestination Calmly Considered, 1752, he largely avoids the language of reprobation, something that John Milton also did in his work as well. So there seems to be a difference here that suggests that by the 18th century and Wesley, the gap had, if anything, widened and lines were being drawn more clearly between Calvinists and Arminians. Whereas Goodwin, seeking to remain ostensibly within the Puritan fold, and clearly holding in 1650 a highly sort of minority position, whereas Goodwin wanted to demonstrate as much affinity and proximity to the Calvinists as possible, Wesley was prepared to underscore the differences and delete the references to reprobation as one example. That's one thing. Secondly, and a linked point, Wesley edited out positive references to Calvin and other Reformed divines as a consistent trend and theme. As I've said, Goodwin's trademark approach, that is, of citing the Reformed Calvinist divines in his arguments in favourable ways, and often heaping praise on them. So Goodwin will often refer to Calvin with such glowing terms. This seems to sit uncomfortably with Wesley from the editorial changes that he proposed to make. For example, on page 19, Wesley puts a line strike, as you can see on the right-hand side there, through a whole paragraph that refers to Calvin and Musculus with admiration. Whereas in a weaker position, as a minority voice, Goodwin attempted a more conciliatory position. Wesley seemed to actively distance himself from these positive references to Calvin and his followers. Thus, Goodwin will cite Calvin and even the Synod of Dort to show points of agreement. Wesley seems to want to emphasise points of difference. So in those two areas, and I give a couple of illustrations there, but they seem to be trends that recur throughout the pages. In those two areas, we see perhaps some more intentional editorial concerns in Wesley's hand. So this paper has indicated a cautious reliance by Wesley on the Arminian publications of this regicidal Puritan. I say that Goodwin, in his more political writings, wrote several tracts to support regicide. So that's an interesting and slightly awkward point for John Wesley by the 18th century. So this paper has indicated a cautious reliance of Wesley on the Arminian publications of a regicidal Puritan from the 17th century, combined with Wesley's trademark ability to edit out and airbrush over awkward features that did not reflect either his own emphasis or a revised context that he found himself in. So the final question that begs to be answered is why, given all of the theological proximity between Goodwin and Wesley that clearly he felt, given the other articles that he published by Goodwin, why, given all of the theological affinity, and after all the hard work of the editing hand of Wesley, why did Wesley actually never publish this work? Yes, that's right, he didn't actually publish it. So he marked it up for publication. I share your disappointment, it never actually got published. Why was this? Well, a couple of possible reasons, I think, suggest themselves. Perhaps it was that in the light of Toplady's criticism that Wesley had raised the ghost of John Goodwin, Wesley wanted to put that ghost to rest and not summon it up anymore. Perhaps it was a more basic reticence to be seen to rely on the writings of this regicidal Puritan who dedicated this particular work to Oliver Cromwell, of all people. Or perhaps it was simply that the moment had passed. By 1782, the main Calvinist controversy of the 1770s had calmed, and it was a time for conciliation. Ironically then, even Wesley's revised version of Goodwin's Irenomachia, the making of peace, was deemed not suitable for making peace. And so Wesley's version, at least, of the ghost of John Goodwin never was summoned to the printing press and now lurks somewhere in the special collection of the John Rylands Library. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. We have some time for questions. I'm sure your figures sort of generated a few to begin with.
So a point of information. In the Christian library, isn't there an extract of Goodwin's works? Not this one, but
Yes, yes, there is. So Wesley published a treatise of justification by Goodwin, and also in the Arminian magazine his commentary on Romans chapter 9. Yeah, but this piece never made it to the press, at least in Wesley's publishing. Yeah.
Around the same time as Goodwin was writing, some of the French Protestants are in the French Protestant stream of Arminians. Was there any interchange?
Are you thinking of Amaro or?
Amaro particularly.
Yeah. Well, he's slightly earlier in his writings, and I think Amyraldianism, by the time of Goodwin, is a position that certain English divines are espousing. Richard Baxter would be perhaps the most high-profile figure who's often thought to hold an Amyraldian view. Goodwin himself, I think the thing with Amyraldianism is that whilst if you're not familiar with these terms, whilst Amyraldianism argues that Christ died for all, not just for the elect, in the end, so there is sufficient grace for all, nevertheless, efficient grace, so that's the sort of clever distinction, sufficient grace is for all, but efficient grace is still only dished out to the elect and is only ultimately going to save the elect. So the bottom line is that the line still holds that salvation is by election, a decree of election, rather than by open to all by faith. And so I think for Goodwin that simply wouldn't be a good enough position to move to. So I think the influence was there on the likes of Baxter. For Goodwin, he went further.
Because that's one of the key influences, I think, on Fletcher and his writings through the 70s.
Okay. I wasn't aware of that, so that's helpful. Thank you.
You said the error was dedicated to Cromwell, or presented to Cromwell. Did Cromwell have any reaction? As in whether it was brought up?
There's no comment from Cromwell. I don't think he wouldn't have been particularly keen to identify himself with Goodwin. Goodwin was, by this stage, was a controversial character. It seems like Goodwin was about to be nominated for as a divine to attend the Westminster Assembly in the mid 40s, and then when this sort of theological shift occurred, he lost favour, or he lost the confidence of some of the Puritan establishment, and so I imagine Cromwell would not have been particularly keen to receive that dedication. But to my knowledge, there's no comment from Cromwell that survived on that.
On the title page of the Random Monkey, he connects it to his congregation, that he's representing the views of his congregation. Talk a little bit more about why he did that and the views of his congregation as far as
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 14 signatories on Arenomachia that largely are the sort of elder figures of it, the elders of his congregation. I imagine part of it is that he's just published Redemption Redeemed as an individual. He's taken enormous reaction from that, and so part of it is wanting to demonstrate a broader consensus. And he had within his congregation a number of fairly influential characters in the London merchant context, so who signed the piece. So I imagine part of it is simply wanting to avoid appearing isolated. But in terms of his congregation, then Goodwin faces ongoing challenges. I think part of the sort of heady days of that 1650s meant that radical ideas were being explored in different directions, and so when he leads the charge on taking on Calvinism with some quite radical alternatives, he finds that his own congregation then are, if you like, being led to think like reformers in areas that he didn't want reform. So some of them become General Baptists, and within his congregation cause a real stir. So Goodwin's congregation was by no means one united front with him. It became a complicated set of new ideas, and I think part of that represents the kind of atmosphere of the 1650s, where people are exploring assumptions that previously were just a given. They're exploring them with new verve. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Augustus Toplady's role in this? I'm wondering whether one of the motives for not publishing it is that all the way through the 1770s, Wesley is being sort of sniped at by Toplady, and there is a sort of animosity between them, and whether that kind of influenced the decision not to publish that Toplady would be a kind of wolf spine about to spring on this again.
I think that's right. I alluded to that at the end, that I think part of it is having had that sort of accusation by Toplady that had already been tabled, the idea that he was raising the ghost of John Goodwin. I think probably that was partly in Wesley's mind. There's so I think I haven't got a lot more to say other than I think that's right. That probably is quite a compelling reason why in the end it didn't make publication, because Wesley at that stage didn't need to stir this one up. There's a helpful quote that as I was reflecting on by Randy Maddox. He was reflecting on Wesley's contextual approach to the predestination debates. And I'll just read a few words. I didn't include it in the paper, but I thought this is quite helpful. He says that Wesley's comments on predestination reveal more contextual variation than perhaps any other doctrine. At times, when he is most concerned about the damaging impact of Calvinist doctrines on his followers, he would issue impassioned defences of unlimited attainment and free grace. But at other times, when he is more troubled by the damage being done within the Methodist movement by the debate over the doctrine, he searched for any possible common ground that he could share with his opponents and the most conciliatory ways that he could express his central concerns. I wonder whether you could almost map that quote, which I found helpful, a little bit onto the 1770s and the 1780s. In the 1770s, his primary concern is these doctrines are damaging. By the 1780s, he may have moved to a place of thinking the debate is damaging, and maybe that's why it never made publication.
Well, I might ask then, are you aware of any other manuscripts that he's marked up like this editorially that did not also see publication?
As in 17th century,
well, actually,
or generally?
Yeah, generally. So if we're looking for a pattern for a reasoning behind why
Yes.
it's not this volume,
Yes.
is this actually something that he tended to do?
Yeah, because within Wesley's personal library, there's this copy. There's also the copy of another work by Goodwin, Pagan's Debt and Dowry, with a Renomachia appended to it. And to my knowledge, I think we did correspond on this briefly, genuinely, and I think to our knowledge there isn't another piece. You may want to chip in on this.
As far as I know, it's not something we were aware of this one when the collection came to us. We weren't aware of any others. It's
No.
not something that we've come across. So it's possible, but yeah.
I dug around a little because there is a couple of copies of Redemption Redeemed from the library, from Wesley College Library, but they weren't Wesley's personal copies. It didn't seem, and they certainly didn't have his hand in them. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the inscription at the very beginning of Wesley's hand. Given that it was never published, what do you think his reason for writing that inscription was? Would it have been included in a final published version once he marked on text? Was it for giving to someone else? Who was he communicating with when he said about the intelligent reader, do you think?
Well, I think because, just going back to that, because Goodwin himself, as you can see, had written this advertisement to the reader, and Wesley's, the line strike goes all the way down through that, so he was effectively saying not that. My assumption is that this genuinely was about to go to publication, and this was to be included as a replacement of Goodwin's to the reader, as opposed to a personal copy to a friend. But I think we probably only can work on assumptions on that, can't we? But it's written in a more general sense, I think, than a personal copy, and it seems to be prepared with the expectation that it would get published. But I'm, very open to alternative explanations, because that's not something I've dug around in more.
I might follow up there. Does this seem to be Wesley's first reading of this work, or has he read it before? So is one explanation potentially that this is one of these works he thought he would agree with, but then when he got into it, it wasn't quite what he imagined?
Well, I think that, so with that, he certainly, Wesley's hand goes right through to the end with adjustments and amendments to be made. So it wouldn't seem that he sort of got halfway through and thought better of it. My instinct, but there's more to be done on this, but my instinct would be that Wesley had pretty thoroughly engaged with Goodwin's writings, along with others, from the 17th century, much earlier than this. There's certainly the publication of treatises of justification, and this Arenomachy would have been one of Goodwin's most published works. Redemption Redeemed, his most famous because of its size and scholarly qualities, but this, his most published, went through more editions. So I think there's every chance that Wesley was previously familiar with it. But that's not something I've researched carefully. So again, that's some detail. Yeah.
Was anybody else publishing in the 18th century?
Arenomachia?
Yeah.
No, not to my knowledge. I think it goes through a lot of editions in the late 17th century and then goes quiet. And I think, Goodwin's role in regicide was very awkward by that stage, and I think so John Coffey, who's one of the other sort of historians that's really looked at Goodwin, argues that it was probably only, and this is an interesting point, but his argument is it's probably only because Goodwin turned to Arminian theology, which after the Restoration became the sort of prevailing approach, that probably saved his life. Otherwise, he may well have been post-Restoration, may well have, or at least kept him out of jail. So everything else about Goodwin was absolutely associated with the Republic, with Cromwell, and with the things that were no longer in fashion.
I mean, what happened in the rounding up of the regicides? Was he left at liberty?
He was. Well, he was obviously sequestered from his clerical responsibilities, but he was left at liberty, and that's the point, that he and Milton, arguably were very much implicated in the regicide and got away with it in ways that others who were arguably less implicated didn't. So it could be that their tendencies towards Arminian theology saved their freedom, preserved their freedom. I mean, that's what John Coffey would argue, and I can see the logic of it, yeah.
Okay, well, that's our time for discussion, so please join me in thanking Andrew once more.
I do, yes. I think Jordan just